Welcome to today's session of our summer series of Meet the Author for the Book Club of Palestine. And today we are very honored to welcome Dr. Lara Sheehi. She's a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, a licensed clinical psychologist, and the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast. Can't wait to listen to that, Lara. It's a fabulous name. Lara's work focuses on psychoanalysis, the psychic refusals central to liberation struggles and life-making in the global South, the psychic dimensions of resistance and revolution, and critical Zionism studies. She's the author of From Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, published this year, and co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. Lara is a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism and is on the advisory board for forensic architecture. Welcome, Lara. Thank you for joining us today. Please, we would love to hear you talk about yourself a little bit and your background. I'm really interested to know what drew you to the topics that you are writing about and that you are podcasting about. Mm-hmm. And we're also very, very interested to hear about From the Clinic to the Streets.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Abigail, Samir, who both reached out to me, the book club on Palestine. It's really an honor to be involved in this, and I'm grateful for you all for the labor of making spaces like this, especially in this moment in time. Right before we were talking about how there are many spaces, but in my mind, in the face of the rise of global fascism and the continued attempt to erase Palestine from every space, there are not enough spaces. And so the more we can sort of antagonize, the more we can push up against it, the more we can take up space and insist that Palestine has a space everywhere, the better shape we're in psychically, affectively, materially. So thank you to everybody involved in making this happen. My name is Lara Sheehi. I guess you know, in my bio, that's the more like formal version of things. But I would say first and foremost, I'm a Lebanese Arab. I say Lebanese Arab. Some folks are just like put their kind of eyebrow up and be like, what's that Lebanese Arab? Why don't you just say you're Lebanese? And I say that because there's a way in which the project of settler colonialism in our region, particularly as headed by the Zionist settler state, is one that works hand in hand with U.S. imperialism to make it seem like somehow Lebanon particularly is separate from Palestine and from the plight of Palestinian liberation. And for me, as a Lebanese Arab, it is to work against this sort of project, this long-term political project that would say that Lebanon somehow is separate from this. To the contrary, I think I defy and reject the borders that were imposed upon us. And I believe that our liberation as Arabs runs through Al-Quds, it runs through Jerusalem. And so for me to say I'm a Lebanese Arab is to make certain that already my identity is politicized and I am for the resistance of our people, whatever that may look like, in working towards self-determination of our region. Much of what we've been seeing in the last 3 years, for example. And when I talk about the region, I'm including Iran, of course. And part of, my work has been, what does it mean to interrogate some of the psychological warfare that has been done to colonized peoples, and particularly in our region, to, for example, have us believe that somehow Iran is the intruder, not the settler colony. That is one example that in real time that we're seeing, the way that this rhetoric is used. And so when you ask me what has interested me in this work, I was an undergrad at the American University of Beirut. I was born and raised in Lebanon, did a little stint outside of Lebanon in Canada, which gives me settler colonial citizenship and freedom of movement, which comes with responsibility. And I think part of learning at the American University of Beirut what it means to be dedicated to the liberation of one's people or one's region. It's the first time I wore a kufiya, and it's the first time I understood from comrades and from revolutionaries who came before me what the responsibility of wearing a kufiya is, that this is not just a symbol. It means a commitment to a particular way of life. It means a commitment to a politics. It means a commitment to the destiny of our peoples, and in a variety of ways, what sacrifices are necessary to make that happen. And that I'm saying that because I started graduate school for clinical psychology in the United States. And I did that and I detail this in the book, in the introduction of the book, I did that having been evacuated from Lebanon after the 2006 Israeli invasion and siege on Lebanon. I knew I was going to graduate school, but I didn't know I would be leaving on a boat that was organized by the Canadian government and the settler citizenship that I happened to have that other people didn't have. And I didn't know that I would be leaving with only 10 kilos of my belongings. And that, I don't tell that story to say that is a traumatic story. It has imprints on me, but I knew who the aggressor was. I knew the condition that was creating that. It was a political condition. It wasn't some natural disaster that made me get evacuated. I knew that this was a long history of Zionist aggression in our region. And I knew that the country that I was being whisked away to, which in that context was the United States, was helping this happen. And so I started graduate school as a clinical psychologist with that central to my being, is being an Arab post 9/11. This was more than 20 years ago. Post 9/11, immediately coming in, thinking to myself that psychology, and particularly psychoanalysis, was an expansive enough field to hold the contradictions that I was dealing with, to hold both the sort of recognition that the way that our world is set up in hierarchies, that the United States had a higher education that could give me the tools that I wanted clinically, but also recognizing that that was built on the plunder of the rest of the earth. Those are contradictions that one has to work through. What was my desire to go outside of my country? Why did I have to leave my country like many people do? The brain drain that our region particularly suffers from. What were the conditions that created that necessity, for example? And the contradictions of the fact that I had the privilege of that movement where so many people were left behind and couldn't even imagine doing that, just like we constantly see. I was in for a rude awakening that in theory, psychoanalysis had that ability. In practice, it was a conservative field. It was a white supremacist field, and it was a very Zionist field. And everything I was told was, there is no space for this. What you are bringing in is a political agenda. That every time I talked about, for example, the things that constituted my life or the life of my people or the global South more broadly, the response would be, no, this is political. This doesn't belong here. You're imposing something on us. Are you going to be ready enough to work with your patients? That's what made me interested in studying this. Because there was another thing that was happening is I came, and this is why I say Lebanese Arab, which is how these things are connected. When I came to the United States and I was in graduate school, I'd never been to the United States before, and I immediately learned the history of Arabs in this settler colony. I'm based in the United States. This settler colony is one that was built on racial hierarchies where immigrants like Arabs are always triangulated against Black and Indigenous people of this settler colony. And I came into a history that was not of my making, but one that I had to contend with. And I realized immediately, oh, people, for some reason, like Lebanese people here, but not when you bring your politics with you. And those politics happen to be Palestine. So immediately, when I was a Lebanese, where I was not letting go of the fight for Palestinian liberation, I was that type of Lebanese. I learned very quickly what the discipline looked like, disciplining me, and particularly in the field. People would have loved to have me as a Lebanese person that didn't have my politics with me. That wasn't going to happen. And so I had to realize very quickly, and it was like by fire, it was trial by fire, realizing, oh, there's something very specific about Palestine that causes psychic collapse. That people who love their theory and who are able to think in complex ways and who actually weaponize that and use that as a way to say, we're so mature, and we can read that as civilizational discourse, as a white supremacist civilizational discourse. Like, oh, those people in the global South, those people over there are immature. They don't have an interiority. We have to teach them, versus the mature, reasonable, white supremacist person from the global North. There was something so immediate about the mere whisper of Palestine that made things fall apart. They couldn't hold on to even the theory that they loved so much the second you spoke Palestine. So for me, that was a clue. I was like, there's something else happening here, something in my Arabness, something in my political commitments. And I started to realize also that the field was very ideological, but it was pretending it was not. And that it got its power from being able to be innocent as a helping field. So everything I've done in my career up until this point, and what brought this book into being, was me slowly using the experiences, the racialized experiences, the Arabophobic experiences, the anti-Palestinian experiences, because it, in many ways, it doesn't matter if you're actually, it matters if you're Palestinian in as much as there's specificities to that. But if you are allied, not, let me not use that word, because it's not just being an allyship, it is being dedicated and committed to Palestinian liberation, you will be treated like that as well. You will be, excluded, you will be punished for it. I had a massive Zionist smear campaign start against me in January 2023, pre-genocide. I started to realize, okay, there's something I need to track here. And that is because this is ideological, and the lie is that it's not. And so I became a critic of the field, and that was what I started to work on. And I started to work on, instead of there's a lot of research that's being done on the mind and psyche of colonized people. There's a lot being done on the other side, and the mind and psyche of the colonizer. And for me, I wanted to think about, what is it that's allowing me to remain clear and aligned in my political commitments? And what is it that allows people in these struggles to remain committed to that? And that is what now, through my book, I have called Psychic Militancy. What are the ways that people can remain clear-minded, even under duress, even under explicit pressures to disconnect from the political fight, under coercion, to make us believe that we have lost, to make us believe that the world will always be like this, to make us believe that our oppressors are the ones who own the parameters of our life, and that nothing can look different. I was very interested in how militants in global struggle and in revolutionary struggles maintain that. Because we can think about the ways in which militants, let's say, because they're always engaged in asymmetric warfare, or political prisoners, for example, there's always asymmetric warfare that's involved. How is it that they retain clarity, even under the most pernicious lies that their oppressor tells, that's backed usually by an infrastructure that is able to actually kill them, murder them, make their life intolerable? They still have a type of focus that I was very interested in studying. And that, again, has been the arc of my career, my research, what I'm interested in, what sustains that. I wrote the book From the Clinic to the Streets. This is the book itself. It's published by Pluto, and I'm so grateful to Pluto for allowing me to write the book that I wanted to write without the compromises that are often demanded. Pluto is a leftist press, and they were very interested in allowing me to write it as I felt it needed to be written. I will say that it's a different book than I had imagined because of the genocide, because of the Zionist settler states, letting go of any pretense or any sense of a sense of morality, even though all of us in the struggle have always known that that is an irreconcilable position with settler colonial project. That settler colonial project, particularly in its Zionist instantiation, is an eliminationist, a nihilist, right, and a nihilistic and ethno-nationalist project. It is irreconcilable with sustaining life, particularly of indigenous people. But I think that became more clear on a global scale post Tawafan al-Aqsa and post October 7th, 2023, is that people started to track that. So I think the focus of the book, the urgency I felt, was, how do I document what people are feeling? What are the ways that our psyche is contested space? So one of the things that started me thinking about this, and then I was able to work backwards and see, look at all the ways in which over the course of my career this has happened, and how do I disseminate it and write it down, and sort of, use examples so this can be a portable logic for people who are feeling this. people would tell me, particularly after October 2023, I feel like I'm going crazy. And the incredible thing about this, kind of like I was talking about tracking before what was happening in graduate school, is that in the same breath, people would tell me, I feel like I'm going crazy, whether those were my patients or comrades I was speaking with, or friends or organizers who'd invite me to come, think through things with them. In the same breath, they'd say, I feel like I'm going crazy. They could describe to me material reality in excruciating detail. There was nothing crazy about their orientation to the world. So it started me thinking, we oftentimes think about oppressive systems as happening, let's say capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, racism, sexism. We think that these structures happen and then we become symptomatic after the fact. What I started to realize and track and really study was how our mind is actually the target. It's not the after effect. It's not an accidental symptom afterwards. It is actually the target of oppressive systems. And particularly if we think about the systems that I just mentioned as expansionist projects. So let's use Zionism as an example. Zionism's goal is expansionist. It is not okay to stay in its place. That's part of the reason why the borders have not been named yet. It's part of the reason why there's a Greater Israel project. It's expansionist at its core. And so I started to think about, if oppressive systems want to do their maximal damage, why wouldn't our psyche also be up for theft? That the expansion actually had to include our psyche and our interiority, not just to brainwash us, but to induce an action in us. And that action is to dislocate us from each other, is to dislocate us from fights that nourish our soul, is to dislocate us and dislodge us from the necessity to believe that a different world is possible, that we could build a world in which the conditions for a genocide could not exist, that this is not normative what we are seeing. What we are seeing is the natural extension of a settler colonial project, but that settler colonial project is not a foregone conclusion, nor is it a necessity, just like capitalism is not a necessity. So I was very much interested in tracking that. And in the book, I call these psychic intrusions. And I go through the history of psychology as a field, but particularly psychoanalysis, in working hand in hand with states and state making to create psychological operations, what we colloquially know as psyops, and how the history of the field has been working with power to make sure that people's minds are intruded upon to the degree that we don't even know anymore that is happening, and we just think this is normative process, that our world will always be like this, and most fundamentally, that we believe in the lie that power tells that they have already won, and that our fight and our struggle for liberation is worthless. That is the biggest takeaway. So for me, the last chapter, the longest chapter, is called Psychic Militancy. And it really is about how do we maintain, in the same way that I was saying before, how do we maintain our connection to material reality to affirm that history that power tells us has yet to be written. Gaza's not gone. Lebanon's not gone. Our fight for a liberated world is not yet done. It's not a foregone conclusion. But psychic intrusions would have us believe that there's nothing left to fight, that we might as well compromise, that we might as well give up, that softening ourselves, changing our language, changing the words, doing whatever, pretzeling ourselves, that those are the ways to win. And my provocation with psychic militancy is to say, what would it mean for us to track this history and to name the condition that makes us feel this? That is a political project of intruding on our mind, that it is about rewiring our interiority, just like settler colonialism changes the material topography. So if we think about Palestine, and think about the checkpoints and about how non-Indigenous settlers came in and changed everything, planted new trees, changed the roads, the same thing in the settler colony now known as the United States, that's external topography. If we can track the same thing trying to happen inside of us, that there's a rewiring and an attempt to reconfigure our internal topography so that feels like that is normative as well. What would it be for us to, at every turn, disrupt that, to understand that is what is happening, and and to say that's not just happening by accident. That is part of a long-term project that the state and the field of psychology has been intimately engaged in. And to reskill us, I call it reskilling, is to reskill us to be able to track this, reskill us to be able to attune to what I call symptomatic registers. And what I do is I just track, for example, large umbrella affective states. That is not meant for me to say that affect or emotions are not natural. It's to say that if we understand that power exploits our internal world, if we understand that our psyche is contested space, it's to recognize and anticipate that in moments when we're feeling these umbrella states, what I walk us through is fear, confusion, despair, and exhaustion, that they are never neutral states, that it's for us to sort of say, what is happening here? Why in this moment am I feeling this? And when I feel this, let's say despair, it's to question, how does power exploit this? I call it commodified despair because it becomes a commodity for power to use and consume and stop us in our tracks and derail us from our movements and make us feel like there's no point to fight. Is to say, who are we also disidentifying from coercively when we're despairing? Because in my mind, if we're remaining tethered to material reality, there are examples every single day for us to track and follow of people who continue to fight and affirm their life despite the hellscape and the deathscape that they are subjected to. Whether those people are in Gaza, in the so-called West Bank, in the 1948 borders now known as Israel, in Lebanon, across Lebanon, not just in the south, in Iran, in Cuba, in Venezuela. There's so many examples for us to look at. I'm always interested in, why do those examples not stay with us? What are the seductions away from that into despair? That's the project of power, is to make us only feel the despair and miss the things that are happening right in front of us. To be able to retain the ability to track what is happening in front of us is a version of psychic militancy. What I'll say is that psychic militancy is not unconscious. My field, psychoanalysis particularly, which I feel an ethical imperative to disrupt, uses the unconscious as almost a counterinsurgent project. Because if things are all unconscious, then we can't control them. Oh, I can't know them. We can't control them. So one of the things that I make certain to say in the book over and over and over again is psychic militancy is a conscious project. That doesn't mean there aren't unconscious processes. I'm interested in knowing and tracking, for example, why one person feels exhausted, another person feels despairing, another person feels fearful. Those might be dependent on the imprints from their own life, including their social location, their families, their particular vulnerabilities, absolutely. But the practice of psychic militancy is a practice of political consciousness. It is a commitment every single day, and it's a practice. And that's what I walk through in the book. And I use many different examples to help us sort of see what that would look like. Examples come from patients, from supervision, from organizers, from revolutionaries, past and present, from political prisoners. And political prisoners factor heavily in the book because they have told us forever how the psyche and emotions are central to the work of power, how power and their oppressors are always trying to intrude upon their psyche and mobilize their affect in a particular way to make them believe that they will never be free. That's number one, that nobody is fighting for them. And that somehow, if they were to be different, if they were to be better incarcerated people, that somehow the condition of incarceration would get better. And I think those are such great examples for us. In the last 3 minutes, I'll just say, before we sort of open it up, is that there's something about one of the things why I wanted to focus on these types of examples is one, so that I'm hoping everybody can see themselves in some way in the book. And that is, by and large, the feedback I've received being on tour for the book, talking with people, is that many folks have felt they can see themselves in it. And that is also part of why I my podcast is a version of this, is what would it mean for us in a public facing way, not behind closed doors, not in private conversations, start to externalize these conversations and have them in a public facing forum. Because if power is doing the work, power relies on secrecy to do its abuse. It does not intend to be challenged. It does not want to be named. So I think whether it's the book or the podcast or this type of conversation, it's to say externalizing this and doing this as a practice both for ourselves and for our commitments to the world and our political commitments is one way we disrupt or at least antagonize, remain in antagonism with the sort of repression and the oppression that power intends to inflict on us. That's part of what I'm trying to work out in the book. One thing I will say is that the book is for comrades. It's not for specialists. It's for people actively in the struggle. I think I'm less interested in liberals. I think partially because liberals have their own mental gymnastics that they go through to protect themselves from this. Part of what I say in the book is that it's actually those of us in active struggle that are far more susceptible to psychic intrusions, because the way that power works is that in the moment you are wrenching yourself from the identifications with power, it'll come down the hardest on you. And that's like Fanonian one, that's Frantz Fanon 101, right? Is that in the moments when you are practicing what he calls disalienation, when you are able to track, this is what the structure does, this is what it stabilizes, this is who it cares about, this is what it wants to dispose of, the psychic intrusions will come down the hardest on you because it is meant to disrupt that. So number one is perhaps not being surprised by that, perhaps building up a daily regimen of expecting and preparing for psychic intrusions. Because I think the other thing that I've learned through my study is that people are often either surprised or more hurt when the same sort of intrusions happen in our organizing spaces, because they think that because we're committed to a particular type of politics, the same things might not replicate themselves. But because power is so pernicious, it needs to replicate itself in spaces to disconnect people. So number one is, how do we stay ourselves against it? How do we build a particular type of stamina? For me, it's also about tracking. It's always tracking the condition that allowed the psychic intrusion to happen. That is an entire field and infrastructure, but it takes practice, and we need to help each other. All of the examples I give, even when they're located in an individual, everything is worked out relationally. Because the point of a psychic intrusion, the reason why I call it intrusion, because I want us to remember this is a political project, and it's a political project of power to intrude upon us. So to disrupt that, or to get in the habit of remaining antagonistic towards it, at the very least, to not allow it be able to settle without a fight, right? That's the part, is how do we learn to continuously do that struggle and not believe the lie that this is just an inevitability.
And avoid
right?
escalation, right?
Exactly. And disrupt. So even like people who tell me I feel burnt out, what is it like for us to think about burnout as being, even though we think we're in relation, if we really analyze it, it's a series of us withdrawing from social relations. And that's what makes us feel burnt out, because we are localizing the responsibility just internally alone, right? Yeah. So, and that's the thing, what I try to walk us through is, number one, how do we rescale ourselves? Number two, how do we track it? How do we see the point of contact of a psychic intrusion? What are the mechanics of it? Those are the things that I'm interested in. And I think when we do that with each other, when we check each other, when we practice, what does it mean to go back to the condition? What does it mean to go back to the structure? We get better equipped to do that. Excellent question. So part of this, let me answer in tandem with what Abigail just said, and then in the question beforehand, is that it's easier to detect when it's in an individual, right? When there is an abusive individual, in many ways, even, I'm not saying it's easy because we know the dynamic of abuse, but it becomes easier. It's when we commute between the individual and the structural, that becomes harder. So part of the question to ask is, what is obfuscated? What gets in the way of us being able to hold on to and access that there is an entire infrastructure and system that is at play here and that is working on me? Sarah Ahmed talks about it in like power needs on you and through you to actually work. So the question to ask in any moment is not to collapse in shame. I'm very careful throughout the book to say shame is mobilized in particular ways to actually also demobilize us. Mm-hmm. So number one is to always ask the question, what system is at play here and what's its intent? To remember, that is part of remembering. And I will say, no affirmation like that is too small to repeat over and over and over and over and over again. One of the things I do in the book, which I've joked about before in other instances, is what makes psychoanalysts hate me gladly, is one of the tenets of psychoanalysis is the compulsion to repeat, the repetition compulsion. And the story that psychoanalysis tells is that if you find yourself in a place of repeating relationally or something, what you need to do is be in more therapy. So you get to a place of non-repetition. And that is a sign of health, that you no longer repeat. What my provocation to us is to saying this is one of the questions is, what would it mean to invert that? What would it mean to seize the repetition compulsion and say, we are repeating because violence is repeating, because the condition of power repeats. So us repeating is actually an affirmation of material reality. It is not pathological. So in the moments when we are seduced into thinking what we're doing is pathological, or even repeating something as small as, there is a condition here that is causing me to feel like this, it can feel like, why am I saying that again? Oh, what's the point anyway? That's so small. Is it going to do anything? Just like people have these conversations about slogans meaning nothing. They don't mean nothing. They have affective power because they tether us to reality. Is to ask that question and say, what's playing on me and through me that in this moment it's hard for me to access what condition is at play? It's hard for me to say that there's a structure here. It's hard for me to remember that this is a political project that has a long history. And instead, I'm localizing the pathology within myself. Even those of us, by the way, who believe in structure, whether it's us as political activists or clinically, where we don't believe in the myth of individuality, but sometimes we still act as though that is what's happening. So that is the question and then when we're in conversation with other people, is to invite them into that. The last thing that I'll say is to invite and do with comrades and friends and anybody around us the work of disruption of normativity. So sometimes we get into this habit of like, well, let's let this slide. Like, this is small. Is this big? Is this small enough for me to take? I mean, this is too small for me to take up. Is to ask the question of, what does that stabilize? And what is the political and social currency of us actually practicing how to disrupt something from being normative? So Zionism in any space needs to be disrupted. Mm-hmm. If for nothing else, to make certain that they know that we will be challenging this, because it's not a normative position, but it's been sold to us as a normative position, as though it has merit in and of itself. That practice of doing that, of telling each other we should do that, that's not a small thing, is another thing that we can sort of provide each other, I think. Thank you for sharing. That overwhelm is an implant. It doesn't come from us because it's made to look so big and so intimidating. And I'm not saying material reality isn't. The state is scary. Surveillance technology is scary. We know what's involved. But the other thing that I'll say is that what I do is invert that. Number one is look at who continues to fight and exist despite the bigness of it. And indigenous people in this settler colony, in the settler state, and in every other settler state in the world continue to exist despite the bigness. That is something that is not a small thing for us to repeat, right? Mm-hmm. Because power lies. They lie to us about how ever expansive they are and that they own every space. And part of me saying our psyche's contested space is to remind ourselves that there are places that they cannot take. Tawfan al-Aqsa was an example of that. In the one space in the world that we were told there is no exit, there's no way out, right? People showed us that the capture of our imagination is part of the problem. And they created a literal portal to show us, even under the most dire conditions, there are possibilities of movement and something else that can unfold, right? That's one thing for us to, and I don't mean that in the abstract sense. I mean that, what would it mean for us to believe that there are always possibilities rather than the foreclosures that power relies on? Let me give you something concrete that might also help with this, because I don't want to just talk in abstractions. If power were so sure of itself, it would not have to perfect modes, particularly of psychological operations all the time. It could go in once and go, I intruded on your mind, that's it. It's internalized. For the rest of your life, you are now beholden to me. But instead, what we see is multi-billions of dollars being spent every single year perfecting this. With this book, I spent a lot of time reading counterinsurgency manuals. The architects of psychological operations and what they do. Psychology, of course, is heavily, the field of psychology is heavily used in this. But one of the things that's remarkable is that they say, militants, you can't change their mind. Don't waste your time doing that. It's too many resources for us to put into. Instead, let's go to the squishy middle. Let's go for the liberals. Let's go for the centrists. Let's go for the fixers. Let's go for the pragmatists. They call them pragmatists. And what they say is, let's make them hate the militants. Let's spread lies about them. Let's make them believe that it's the militants that are their problem, that if only the militants weren't there, their life would be better. I think that's a clue to us. They're the architects of psyops, and they're telling us this doesn't work. So it helps us actually hold on to why being militant is important, because even the architects of power are saying, we can't get near this because they have a cause bigger than this. They wouldn't admit that if that weren't the truth, right? The last thing I'll say, and I hope folks will, I dropped the link to my podcast in the chat, but I just released an episode with Nick Estes, who is an indigenous scholar in the settler colony of the United States. And one of the most beautiful things he said in that is the way that settler colonialism works is to make, and he was talking particularly about his tribe, that make us believe that our best days can't be yet to come. And that feels so powerful. Like, why is it? There's something about power that, and Fanon teaches us this, that it's not just about interrupting and intruding on our present. It is about reaching into our past and also into the future and making that impossible. So that is a provocation to me and to us to say, what would it mean if we could believe that our best days are yet to come? Because that is us breaking out of the story and the parameters of what power or these infrastructures, settler colonialism wants to tell us, that your best days are behind you because we annihilated you. And he's just like, no, our best days are yet to come.
Just very quickly, I wanted to say about overwhelm, and it sort of echoes what Lara says. It's not a pathology to feel overwhelmed. It's a reaction to an overwhelming environment. In fact, nothing we feel is a pathology. All our feelings are a reaction to what's around us. So if you start by telling yourself, actually, it's okay, what I'm feeling is all right, you validate your own experience, that the power that that environment has on you begins to diminish at that moment that you do that.
I think a lot of people have this question. So there's a couple of things that I would say is, number one is, this is an example, an in vivo example for us to practice what it means to track psychic intrusions that we might not even know are there. So the fact that there's infighting is often made out to be a singular failure of the left. whether we actually believe that or not, there's always a way in which it is painted as though this is the downfall of the left. It's because there's so much infighting, rather than us thinking about it as representative of relational processes that are always emerging and dynamics are unfolding. That, of course, there's going to be infighting, fractures, whatever, that maybe we not think about them as necessarily pathological, but more so telling us about a particular moment. That's number one, is to think about, how does this story of the failures of the left, who does that actually, and I'm not saying don't be critical, we need to constantly be, but the way it's narrated is always a pessimistic, like every movement has failed and this is the reason why it's failed. That's something for us to pay attention to and be like, okay, this is really interesting, right? So for example, in one of my book talks, I had a student who was part of the student intifada there, and she asked a similar question, and she said, but it wasn't sustainable to do this because there was and one of the things I asked her to think about is, can we think about the conditions that made it necessarily unsustainable? Because the entire infrastructure came down on you. It actually was set up to not be sustainable in the same ways that we see leftist uprisings. Everything gets thrown at us, and then we locate it as though it's a failure of ours, rather than the movement of the entire system going against it. So that's number one, is just to question that. Number two is a practical thing, I think, for me, is who we organize with might be different than who we entrust our most intimate selves with, right? And that might feel like a difficult line, because I think so many of us live in a world in which everything we hate is shoved down our throats, every single space that we're in, whether where we work or, just driving with billboards or watching TV, everything we're diametrically opposed to is constantly in our faces. So it might feel like, oh, the people I organize with, I want this space to do everything for me. And I see that a lot. What would it mean for us that, like, we actually don't need a cadre of intimate people to help us do this work? Oftentimes it's 1, 2, or 3 people that we really trust, and that it might be different than who we organize with. Because when we're organizing, we're coming together around a particular goal with a known enemy in mind and particular strategies, even if we don't agree fully. Like, the joke I always make is, if Hamas and the PFLP can come together, like we all can come and organize together, right? Or just look at the histories of people coming together because they understand what their common goal is and who their actual enemy is. That doesn't mean their ideological, positions are 100% the same. No, that is strategic, sort of saying, here I can come together, but this might not be the place in which everything gets resolved. Do I have those other places? And I think that's maybe part of what we try to find. But I often hear people think that those circles must be bigger. And I do think that is part of, number one, psychology, developmental psychology, all this sort of stuff, telling us that the bigger our social circles are, the healthier we are. That's a myth. It can be, but if you have 1 or 2 intimate people, that's not a failure of yours to be like a social being. But that is the story we're told. We end up feeling like failures if we don't hold on to relationships from our childhood, like somehow that, or a familial relation. All these variations of what constitutes health and what doesn't is another place for us to question and be suspicious and be like, what is that actually stabilizing? What are the messages I'm getting around this? What does this make me do to myself? How does this discipline me in a particular way? And what does it make me miss out on? I think those are, to go back to Andrea's question of what do we ask ourselves? Those are other examples that get at what you're also asking. I think to divest ourselves from like the shock that these fields are used as arms of the state to propagandize and to mobilize particular points. And the real important thing is that so nothing else is available. Because if you open that up as a rubric of understanding of the world, that, for example, in this case, Jewish folks are forever locked into a history of persecution, then that is the framework from which everything emerges and nothing else becomes possible. It forecloses solidarity movements, it forecloses anything because it locks you in place. That's just one example of that. And I think the same thing has been done, of course, to Jewish Arabs, right? Is that there's an impossible political wager that is demanded. It's a coercive political wager that is demanded of people that is, of course, riddled with ahistorical non-truths, but fundamentally is working on a coercive identification in which you must choose, but that relational coercion is never to be spoken of. The demand is of you, right? To identify in a particular, and it's an impossible choice that's set up in theory, right? These are the coercions. I think psychic intrusions work on coercions. They work on psychic inversions. There's always that demand, but that you are in there and able to read that, I think says something very important about your connection and alignment with material reality, to read it as the psyops that it absolutely is.
Well, that gives me makes my skin crawl when you told about this, Musa. I would never attend anything like that. I grew up with this, that you have to think of yourself as a persecuted and hated person and live in fear. This is how I was indoctrinated growing up in Israel. And that continues outside of Israel through the Jewish community. And then, of course, that blocks all conversation about anybody else's victimhood or anything that the Israeli state is doing. Where do we even start? Lara, is there any last words for us? Any words of wisdom for us activists? There are people everyone in this group is doing something. And I've always told people that there is no one way to be an activist. There are many ways to be an activist as there are people. We all have different skill sets. We all have different passions. So everybody does it in their own way, because a lot of people say to me, I don't think I'm a good activist. I don't think I'm doing enough. I don't go out on rallies. And I say to them, you care, you think, you talk.
That's right.
You come to a group like this, that's activism for me. It means you're a person with agency in the world, and you're not giving in to that psychic intrusion. You're saying, no, I'm resisting that.
Yes.
I'm a person. I have my own thoughts. Thanks very much. So that's activism. In a world like ours, just being whole and resisting, that is already activism, even if you don't do anything else. So
that's right.
Last words. I'm absolutely delighted to meet you. You have no idea.
Same here. Thank you for this space. Thank you.
Any last advice to our people?
Antagonisms are important and remain antagonistic.
Because we're told not to be, especially women.
Absolutely. We are disciplined. That's carceral discipline. But what I'll say is that it is a horrific time that we live in. And it's also a time of great possibility, because the global majority is on our side. The global majority believes in a free Palestine. The global majority understands the United States is the biggest purveyor of violence in the world, backed by the imperial UK as being the great plunderer of the world. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of that. Our liberation is certain.
I know. Thank you so much, Lara. I can't tell you. I mean, I could listen to you all evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this.
Oh, it's wonderful. I'm so pleased you found the time to be.